To me, it seems like a long time since I've spoken to you. The past 2 Sundays, we've had guest speakers. Adrian, 2 weeks ago, and last week, Jerry Falk speaking to us. I've enjoyed being able to listen to those men, but I've missed being able to talk to you. And so it's good to be with you this morning and be able to do that. And last Sunday, by our tradition, it would have been the Sunday that I devoted to our annual theme of love one another. But since I wasn't speaking, I didn't do that. But I wanted to catch up and do it this morning and speak along the theme of love one another. And especially this morning, I want to talk about an aspect of love for one another that is so important, so relevant, but so easy to overlook. And so I want to try to set this before you in such a way that, well, we can encourage each other to action on a very needful avenue, in a very needful avenue. It's easy when you're reading the book of Genesis to just burn through that and not catch the deep significance of everything that's mentioned there. Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." There is the foundation of the family. There is the first family created from the first man and the first woman. God is the originator. God is the designer of that arrangement. And it's the unit through which children are produced. In and through that union can come, and they do not always come. A couple is a complete family as a man and wife. And if children do not come, they are still a complete family. But children do come through this union. And it is the union in which those children are to be raised, in which they are to be nurtured. And dear ones, it cannot be improved upon. It cannot be improved upon. And we'll talk more about those who think that they can improve upon this arrangement. But as with most things in this realm in which we live, this some call broken world, things happen to families, and families can be broken. James chapter 1, verse 27, as James is so practical in his teaching, he says that religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this. Do you want to get basic? Do you want to get real? What does it really mean to be religious in God's understanding of it? Well, 2 things, he says. Visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. I want to concentrate this morning on these 2 factions, or these 2 different situations, groups, if you will, orphans and widows. And that's what I want to focus on this morning, as how our efforts should be directed at loving them. Just a few statistics about this. Dear ones, there are between 18 and 19 million children in these United States, by some reckoning, that have no biological father, that have no stepfather, that have no adoptive father. And that turns out to be about 1 in 4. About 1 in 4 children have no father in the home. And when we were reading in James 1:27, it mentioned orphans. But there's another term, a biblical term, that includes even more than just orphan, and that's the fatherless. And you'll see in the Old Testament, when we go back to a number of passages there, it's not just the orphan who's in trouble, and we take orphan to mean one who has neither father nor mother. It's the fatherless who are in trouble, who are at risk. And we'll talk about that a little more as we go on. But just think about that. That's 1 in 4. That's 25% of the children in the United States growing up without a father figure or father. Is that a problem? I want to take you back 30 years. This thing played out 30 years ago. Some of you older ones will remember this. I imagine you younger folks have no idea what I'm talking about. But there was a television show called Murphy Brown, and it was on CBS. And it ran from 1988 to 1997. And then there was one more season, as I was looking it up, there was one more season in 2018. It ran for a few episodes in 2018 again, and I don't really know why, but there was that standalone season later. But during the play of this show, the way it was playing out, Murphy Brown, played by Candice Bergen in the red, the character became pregnant, and the father didn't want anything to do with it, and she just said, I'll raise that child on my own, in the show, of course. And I'm not exactly sure, I didn't watch it exactly how she was portraying it, but what she was doing caught the attention of then Vice President Dan Quayle. And Dan Quayle, in 1992, 30 years ago, in a speech in San Francisco, criticized what that show was portraying. And his exact words were, they're mocking the importance of fathers by bearing a child alone. Murphy Brown was mocking the importance of fathers. And what resulted from that was just a media of, loved that there was that controversy, and it was back and forth, and it was quite the thing. You can read about it and see all that happened after that. They gave Dan a very hard time for saying that, but that was a very public consideration of the importance of fathers. And the media in general, and the response of Hollywood at the time, was to dismiss the need for a father and say it's absolutely fine for a child to be raised without a father. We now have 30 years of data since then to see who was right. And the bottom line is that Dan was right, but he didn't say it hard enough, and he didn't say it firm enough. Let me show you what we're talking about. When you look at children in a fatherless home, these children are vulnerable. And these children are often in a very difficult set of circumstances. A child from a fatherless home or in a fatherless home is more likely to live in poverty, is more likely to have behavioral problems both at home and in school, is more likely to suffer infant mortality, to actually die as a child. He's more likely as he grows to commit a crime. He's more likely to be abused. And a pretty dark example of this, a few years ago there was a movie called Spotlight. I don't know if you saw it, but it was about the Boston Globe's investigation into the cover-up of sexual abuse in the Roman Catholic Church. And one of the things they uncovered as they were investigating was that these abusive priests often targeted fatherless boys to abuse. A fatherless child is more likely to be abused. A fatherless child is more likely to abuse drugs. A fatherless child is more likely to be obese. A fatherless child is more likely to drop out of school. There are all sorts of awful things that are more likely to happen to children without fathers. And so, what about folks who glorify the idea that a child doesn't need a father? Now, I know there are situations where the family breaks, the father's gone, and something needs to be done. We're going to talk about that. But what do you say to people who say a father isn't important and is not needed in a home? I think Peter was talking about such in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 8 through 16. And if it were just me doing this, I might apologize as I read 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 8 through 16, for how hard this hits and for what this says. But it's in the context of God knowing how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. It says, bold and willful, they do not tremble as they blaspheme the glorious ones, whereas angels, though greater in might and power, do not pronounce a blasphemous judgment against them before the Lord. But these, like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant, will also be destroyed in their destruction, suffering wrong as the wage for their wrongdoing. They count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. They are blots and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions while they feast with you. They have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained in greed, accursed children. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing, but was rebuked for his own transgression. A speechless donkey spoke with human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. Especially the phrase in there, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant. Those who challenge God's plan for the family and say that they can improve upon it. Father, mother, child is God's design, and it cannot be improved upon. But things happen. What if father or mother is gone? True religion is for us to help in that situation. And you might think, well, 18 or 19 million, how in the world am I going to affect that? How am I going to fix 18 or 19 million that are without a father? Well, I think Satan wants us to think that way. I think God wants us to think, what can I do to help one? What can I do to help one person, one child, who's growing up without a father? How can I improve that situation? What can I do? And dear ones, that's a challenge I'm going to give you in this coming week. Can you find a child that's fatherless and reach out and somehow encourage and somehow help that one? There are lots of different organizations that are willing to help you do that. But under our theme of loving one another, I invite you to help one orphan, one fatherless child this week. And that brings up the topic of widows, the other group mentioned in James 1:27. A few more statistics on this. There are 13 million bereaved people in the United States by someone's estimate, and 11 million of them are women. Just 2 million widowers. Guys, husbands, the odds are against us. Outliving our spouse. The chances are, the statistics say, the women outlive us. And the average is that widow lives 14 years after the spouse's death. And statistics tell us also that the annual income for a widow is about $17,500. Did you know we have an American Institute of Stress? It kind of stresses me out to know that we have one. A little bit. But we have an American Institute of Stress. And they have a scale called the Holmes-Raw Life Stress Inventory. And I've just taken the top portion of it here. There are many other entries in here, but they give a scale from 1 to 100 of how stressful an event is. And you can see starting down at the bottom, number 10, retirement from work is stressful. You think that'd be a good thing, but it's stressful. This is, I don't know, kind of astounding to me. Marital reconciliation with a mate. It's stressful to reconcile after being apart. But it goes up, being fired. Marriage is stressful, person. But the number one stressor on this whole gradation of all the different life events that can happen, the most stressful thing is the loss of a spouse. That affects someone profoundly. It's probably the most stressful thing that will ever happen to them in a lifetime. And, we tend to respond in the moment when the person loses the spouse. But then we tend to let that fade and not do too much after that. One of the most troubling things that I've seen, and that you've seen probably too, is that as the fatherless are vulnerable, so are widows vulnerable. And there are those who prey on widows. One widow that I worked with when I was in Pennsylvania was just a sucker for anything that would come along, and she'd buy it. And it was so hard. And another was, it just seemed like that the breaks in a situation, deciding to spend or to commit, we're not there anymore. And this woman would go off and do things that weren't wise. But it's not a new thing, dear ones, that there's someone who takes advantage of a widow. Look at this. These are the words of Jesus. And in hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at the feast, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. It didn't mean that they were actually going to go and chew on the bricks and eat the house. What they meant there was that they were going to spend the money. They were going to get that money that widow had and spend it for themselves. That's an awful reality in this world, but it's a reality. Widows are more vulnerable as the fatherless are. So what does it mean to love widows and orphans? Well, now we're back to the reading this morning. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 16 through 21. Let's look at that again and see what God said. And what you'll see is, as we love actively the widow and the orphan, we're like God, because that's exactly what he does. And it's exactly what he's called us to do. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow. He loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God. You shall serve him and hold fast to him, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise. He is your God. He has done for you these great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen. And he goes on one more verse to just demonstrate his great power in the family of Jacob. He said, your fathers went down to Egypt, 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven. That's what your God can do. That's what your God does. But dear ones, it isn't just a positive statement of what we should do. There's a negative statement for us And this is strong. If we don't do this, if we don't pay attention to the needs of the fatherless, and we don't pay attention to the needs of the widows, or if we pay attention and don't do anything about it, all the way back to the law of Moses, look what he says in Exodus chapter 22, verses 21 through 24. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Isn't that brutal? I don't think I've ever seen that before. I know I've read the book of Exodus before. But he tells us, if you overlook these people, watch out and see if your family doesn't be, it says especially to fathers. Fathers, if you're going to do that, they're going to lose you and your family. So a stern warning to widows, or to those who would mistreat widows and orphans. And I've talked about this, by the way, I owe a tip of the hat to a fellow named Scott Beyer, who I heard preach this lesson, and I was just amazed by it, and I wanted to pass it along to you, but Scott put this together. It's coming out of the Lord's will and word, but I had to give a hat tip to him. He coined the phrase, being the voice of the voiceless. And I thought that was such a great way to refer to this, a voice of the voiceless. What do you mean by that? Well, there are those in our society who have no voice. Think of those who do have a voice. If we ignore our spouse, they will have a voice, and we will hear about that. If we ignore our boss, he has a voice, she has a voice, we will hear about that. If we ignore the IRS, they've got 87,000 new people to come and make sure we listen to them. Okay? They have voices. But the widow and the fatherless have no voice. They have no formal standing in our society. And if we ignore them, they won't say anything. We won't hear it. It's on us to go and see them in their situation, because we can't hear their cries unless we're trying, unless we're reaching out, unless we care enough to hear the voice of the voiceless and then be the voice of the voiceless. And a great example of this in the Old Testament, again, was the book of Job and the man of Job. In Job chapter 29, Job spends the whole chapter looking back to the old days. And certainly for him, the old days were a lot better than where he was, covered in scabs and sores, sitting on an ash heap, scraping himself with a piece of pottery, a broken piece of pottery, which doesn't seem like it had helped much, but okay, that's what he was doing. But listen to this, when Job looks back on the former days and talks about how he reacted and how he helped the widows and the orphans. When the eye heard, it called me blessed. When the eye saw, it approved, because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to help him. The blessing of him who was about to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind. I was feet to the lame. I was father to the needy. And something I just said caused my tablet to go and try to find an answer for me somewhere. I can't believe that. Just when you think you're not going to have any kind of a glitch that Sunday, then it decides to help me. All right, where was I? I was father to the needy, and I searched out the cause of him who I did not know. I broke the fangs of the unrighteous. He's a protector, do you see? I broke the fangs of the unrighteous and made him drop his prey from his teeth. Then I thought, I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the sands. My roots shall spread out to the waters, with the dew all night on my branches, my glory fresh with me, and my bow ever new in my hand. When he looks back to his days of righteousness, he was all about helping poor, helping the widow, and helping the fatherless. And we know Job was more righteous than any in the East. We started with James chapter 1, verse 27. We considered first the widows. Now we just considered the orphans. In conclusion, I want you to, as is always a good practice, consider James 1:27 in its context with me. Back up just a couple of verses to verse 25, and let's read that now with the two verses that precede it. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. If anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Dear ones, when it comes to orphans and widows in the context of this, it is not enough to be a hearer. We must be doers. So I invite you to not only seek a fatherless child to help, but to seek a widow as well. I think I looked through our rolls and we only had our sister Wanda, who's affected that way. I'm not sure, but well, no, too, Miss Helen too. But we have widows. A regular looking at how they're doing is appropriate. And what can you do? What can you do to be the voice of the voiceless? What can you do to care for widows and the fatherless? A challenge for us all as we go forth this week. And this is under the theme of loving one another, our theme for the year, 2022. So thankful for your presence, and we always make a time when we're together to get right with the Lord. We don't think it's right to leave here if there's something that needs to be confessed in a public way so that we can go to God in prayer on your behalf and seek his forgiveness through the work, the gift of Jesus, the sacrifice of his son, Jesus. But also for those who would put Christ on in baptism, having confessed him, believing in him, repenting. All those things are appropriate, and all those things can be done in a short time right here, right now. If you're subject to the call, won't you come while we stand and sing the song of invitation, God calling yet.